Go.
Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Huntington's disease. My name is Destiny.
Mark.
Stephanie.
Eduardo.
So what is Huntington's disease? Huntington's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder of the central nervous system. So that means it gets worse as time goes on. And it's caused by a genetic mutation, specifically on chromosome 4. It has a person with Huntington's disease will have a multiple CAG DNA sequence. So if you look on the bottom right-hand side, the top sequence is a person who is healthy. They only have one repeat of the CAG. And then on the bottom is a person with Huntington's disease. So they have multiple copies of that one sequence. And Huntington's disease causes damage to the basal ganglia and the cerebral cortex. So we know the basal ganglia is in charge of this action selection. So it decides what movements we're going to execute. It also plays a role in learning and maintaining skills. The cerebral cortex, on the other hand, is associated with perception, awareness, and memory. So if we have damage to those areas of the brain, we're going to see things like behavioral disturbances, psychiatric disturbances, uncontrolled movements, mood swings, and also difficulty swallowing.
So Huntington disease can appear at an early or late age, but most often it appears at the age of 30 to 50. There's not really quite a good explanation on why this tends to happen. So 3 out of 7 of 100,000 people are diagnosed or affected with Huntington disease. Huntington disease can affect all race, but there's a studies done where they found that individuals with European descent have a higher rate of inheriting or getting Huntington disease due to them having a high number of B7 alleles that associates with a high number of CHG repeats. So an average person has around 20 CHGs, while a person with Huntington disease has around 40 or more. They also found that individuals with Japanese, Chinese, or African descent have a lower risk of inheriting or getting Huntington disease due to them having a high number of 8-10 alleles that associates with a low number of CHG repeats. So as mentioned in the first slide, it's a genetic mutation. And if we look at the picture on the right, if the person has the gene and that person ends up having children, then there's a 50% chance that there's one that ends up getting the gene, there's another one that doesn't. And if we look at the child on the right, if that child ends up having kids, his future kids will not be affected. And also, excuse me, sorry. And then, so Huntington's disease does not discriminate. So it affects both male and female. They have the same rate of getting or inheriting the disease. So at least 10% are late onset diagnosed. Late onset means a diagnosis after the age of 60. This tends to happen due to doctors misdiagnosing patients who have the genes, and they believe that a person older than 60 cannot get the disease due to them being too old. So now I'll pass it on to Destiny.
Okay, so for our skill performance, we decided to focus on walking. So a study that we found, it was relatively small. It was only 7 people though that had Huntington's disease, and other people also who served as a control. The study found that people with Huntington's disease tend to have a higher variability in their step as well as their stride length. And this causes some jerky movements to happen, so it makes their walking unstable. They walk at a much slower velocity and they try to avoid single limb support. So they're looking for a larger base of support in order to get them through their walking. But if the person with Huntington's disease have these jerky movements, it also makes it harder for them to perform other daily tasks in their life. A lot of people who have Huntington's disease talk about dropping cups and stuff like that a lot, as well as them taking longer to just complete tasks. So it's very hard for a person who has Huntington's disease to be independent. And to show you what a person who has Huntington's disease would look like walking, this is an example.
As opposed to the hypokinetic gait, we now have the hyperkinetic gait, which we see what we call a choreiform gait or chorea. With this gait, there are not only abnormalities in the gait itself, but associated movements. There can be orofacial dyskinesias in which the patient will be having movements of one side or the other side of the face, kind of a grimacing type of a fashion. There can be movements in the upper extremities, and there are fragments of semi-purposeful type of movements or writhing type of movements. And then the legs will also start to go. And so the patient attempts to walk, get the superimposition of the movements, but the patient doesn't actually fall because the balance is not affected. Just you have these involuntary movements that are now being superimposed on the gait.
So that's just an example of what it could look like with a person who has Huntington's.
As opposed to
So Huntington's disease has no cure, and the treatment available right now is at best supportive, meaning you can only help with managing the various symptoms of the disease. And while Huntington's disease itself is not fatal, the most common causes of death are related to respiratory dysfunctions, maybe occurring from a lung infection, or injuries occurring from falls. This is why most of these treatments here are focused more around motor control and muscle weakness aspects of the disease. So in terms of pharmacological treatments, you have tetrabenzaline, or the brand xenazine. It's the first medication that's actually been approved by the FDA, and it helps in treating the involuntary movements of chorea for someone with Huntington's disease. Tetrabenzaline is an involuntary movement reducer, or also known as a dopamine depleter. It works by inhibiting a special type of monoamine transporter called the VMAT2, which itself is responsible for controlling how much of a certain neurotransmitter is released into the synapse. And one of these main ones is actually dopamine. So as we know, the basal ganglia, where action selection, the smoothing out, and coordinated intended movements occur, is heavily dependent on dopamine. And chorea itself is the result of an overreactive basal ganglia and the excess of dopamine, which is why tetrabenzaline has been found to be a successful drug, at least in trying to control the symptoms of such uncontrollable movements. While other drugs do exist, such as risperidone, haldol, and thorazine, and could still currently be used under various other generics, none of them are actually FDA approved, which is why I'm not really focusing too much on details of them. Although they can target other symptoms of disease, cognitive or emotional, they're also associated with a much larger side effects. And so these pharmacological treatments are very highly individualized, as every case of Huntington's disease is different. So whatever might work for one person is not necessarily going to work for someone else. So as we continue to the next slide, the physical therapy is one of the main rehabilitative approaches to help slow down the progression of the disease and help the individual at least sustain a good quality of life. So the role of physical therapy is the treatment is dependent on the progression of the disease in the individual. So here I was able to find a nice chart demonstrating the various levels of progression, the main problems associated with each progressive level, and the intervention plans needed to be implemented. So initially in the beginning, you'll focus more on balance and stability. And as the disease progresses, you shift your focus towards more of range of motion flexibility as more muscle problems such as rigidity and muscle contractures become more common. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, injuries related to falls are one of the main causes of death, but also respiratory functions. So as the disease evolves, your muscles in the mouth and throat may get affected, and this could cause swallowing problems or breathing problems in someone with Huntington's disease. And in such cases, you may seek out speech therapies if an individual has problems speaking, or you move on back to physical therapy in a sense, and you focus on certain breathing techniques. And some of those are listed out here are called pursed lip breathing and diaphragmatic breathing, where you actually target the muscles of the face, the chest, and your diaphragm. So these exercises aren't necessarily just to help strengthen respiratory muscles, but also the mouth, jaw, and face. And while these may sound silly, the effects of them may be life-saving.
So as we know, Huntington's disease affects hundreds of thousands of people in the world. And as an autosomal dominant disease, a person only needs one copy of the mutant Huntington gene to develop the disease. Huntington disease is a progressive and aggressively debilitating brain disorder that causes uncontrolled movements, psychological problems, and loss of cognition. It is caused by a mutation in the gene that encodes the protein Huntington, causing it to build an abnormally long tail of the amino acid glutamine. This tail prevents Huntington from folding properly, and as a result, it aggregates inside neurons of the brain, and eventually it kills them. So with the current science, scientists target to lower the levels of Huntington or to inhibit its aggregation, or a combination of both of them. This is done by either silencing the Huntington gene or by activating cellular mechanisms that promote the degradation of the protein itself. Future research recommendations: scientists have discovered an enzyme called the TBK1 kinase enzyme in the cell, which adds phosphate groups to various biomolecules like protein or DNA. These phosphate groups are energy carriers, so by adding one, it turns on the receiving molecule. Researchers found that when TBK1 adds a phosphate group anywhere in the first 17 amino acids of Huntington, it inhibits its ability to aggregate in both the normal and mutated versions of Huntington. By increasing TBK1 levels in cells, it leads to overphosphorylation of a specific amino acid in the Huntington chain, which stabilizes the protein and stops it from aggregating. Next slide, please. So this enzyme, called TBK1, plays a central role in regulating the degradation and clearance of the Huntington protein, and it introduces chemical modifications that block its aggression. The scientists believe that this represents a viable target for the development of possible treatment of Huntington's disease. For future outlook, by using this TBK1 enzyme to treat Huntington's disease, it's still very much in the research phase. This diagram on the right is of a roundworm, which is the first trials of the research phase. The lab of Halal identified that TBK1 phosphorylates the Huntington protein at S13 and S16, and it identified its role in regulating its aggregation, clearance, and toxicity. This study showed that TBK1 mediated increase in phosphorylation and/or promoting mutant Huntington autophagic clearance, which shows viable therapeutic strategies for treatment of Huntington's disease and other similar neurodegenerative diseases.
And those are our slides. Thank you guys for watching.